Welcome one and all to Bike Racing Without Mercy. Today exploring how I used heat training in my final prep in order to provide a tangible improvement in fitness plus a fast time, as you saw in my last video, during the impeccable Band of Climbers Toughest 110 km Sportive. I'll show you the martial arts sweatsuit that I'm using to warm me up fast, plus the core heat training monitor, which although not essential, does provide enlightening data so as to control a training method that can be extremely stressful on the body. And certainly for me, it helps sustain a Goldilocks core temperature of 38.5 to 39.5 degrees Celsius, which gives an endurance athlete the maximum benefit of this training method without having to push the pedals overly hard or indeed stress the body too much. I'll also show some of the specific Threshold and VO2 Max training sessions that provided the finishing touches on what was a good level of base fitness, all in helping me exceed my own ambitions with a 4 hour 44 time and first place in 110 km.
Elegant, this is not. A booster suit to really dial up the heat training. A core training monitor is on the way. The perceived exertion is way high for a low zone 2 ride. I put this on the back end of a specific training program preparing for the Band of Climbers hardest 110. I'll show you that in a second, but this is proper emotional. I'll report back. And with all the hype surrounding heat training, I'm giving it a go ahead of the Band of Climbers hardest 110. This heat training is tagged on to the end of a specific training for the hardest 110. I'll show you that in a minute. It was proper emotional. Lots of VO2 max and ending with a hard, just above threshold effort for 15 minutes. This is the Hayabusa sweatsuit or sauna suit. Boy, does it make life proper emotional. Low zone 2 is, well, perceived effort 9 or 10. Heart rate is soaring like a phoenix. A core monitor to measure the temperature of the body is on the way. I'll report back. Cheers.
Well, that was 45 minutes of heat training on the back end of a 2 hour VO2 Max Band of Climbers simulation. I'll show you that in just a second. The benefits of heat training are as follows. Basically, the body dissipates the heat that is accumulating as a result of the exercise through the skin, i.e. sweat, and the heat is evaporated through the sweat with the heat going into the air, convection, heat exchange it is called. And the benefit of heat training in a suit like this is that it raises the core temperature, the body's core temperature earlier, you sweat earlier, the perceived exertion is of course a lot higher, the heart rate rises much faster, and the body gets used to dissipating the heat faster. Additionally, other benefits are the blood plasma improves and increases, i.e. more oxygen in the blood, therefore definitely there should be an aerobic benefit after a block of heat training, and the perceived exertion when you're at normal temperatures should be lower. Plus, of course, if you're having an event or something and it's hot, you're much better able to withstand the event and deliver a kind of a power that's more commensurate with what you might have at kind of normal, kind of Northern European temperatures. Anyway, that was proper difficult. I averaged about 174 watts for 40 minutes and had to drop the power for the final 5 minutes to about 160, 161. And the heart rate rose throughout all of that to about 173 before I dropped the power. And then after I dropped the power, it kind of dipped into the kind of mid 160s and then rose again like a phoenix to 176. So you can see certainly it is high perceived effort for what for me is a moderate zone 2 power. I'd normally have somewhere between 125 and 130 BPM for a couple of hours at that kind of pace. Now, I tagged it on to the end of a Band of Climbers kind of VO2 Max training with a hard threshold effort at the end to kind of simulate the kind of fitness that you need in order to hopefully, fingers crossed, get a good times at the hardest 110, 3,500 meters of climb. And the training was as follows. And as for the Fred Whitten, indoors, I've set up a training plan to replicate the kind of fitness that hopefully will help me and serve me well for the Band of Climbers Toughest 110, 3,500 meters of climbing. Now, it's in the Sheffield Peak District region, so you've got a lot of short, steep climbs where you're dipping heavily into VO2 max, and then you've got the steep descents where you can recover. So starting with a nice warm-up into threshold and a little bit of VO2, a couple of minutes recovery, then a hard 1 minute at 3:30, just to fire up the nervous system, 5 or 6 minutes recovery before the main VO2 max efforts to simulate the climbs. 5 minutes, 292, 4 minutes, around about 130, 140, another 3 minutes, about 310, 4 minutes, 130, 140, 5 minutes, 292, another 4 minutes, 130, 140, then 3 minutes max, hopefully a little bit above 310. Then 20 minutes, taking it easy, recovering. You don't actually get that in the band of climbers, but equally, the intensity of those first 4 climbs is probably a little bit more, I reckon, than I'll be deploying for that. Then a hard start, 1 minute, around about 310, into a nice threshold, about 265 watts for 3 minutes, and a hard end, another minute, around about 320, 330, just to really wear down the fitness a little bit. Then, as you get on the band of climbers, a lovely luxurious descent ahead of Burbage Moor, about 8 minutes of recovery there before a ramp of power into a final 15-minute tough effort at just above threshold, I reckon, overall, about 265, 270 watts for the 15 minutes. Then get the Hayabusa suit on, and then 45 minutes of misery for the heat training adaptation. Around about 174 watts for 40 minutes, then the final 5 minutes at 160. So a proper hard morning of training, time now to carb up, recover, and take on plenty of H2O and electrolytes. Tomorrow will be a nice, easy zone 2 with maybe a heat training for the final hour. "12 days out from the band of climbers, hardest 110. I've just completed my 4th heat training. This time looking to go for as long as I could, but with a very controlled effort, watching the heart rate to make sure it doesn't go above 165. The idea being to have as much time as possible in the heat training zone and still awake the core, so I'm not 100% sure exactly how long I was in my heat training zone, but trust me, it was a proper emotional 1 hour 35 minutes. I'll show you what I did now. But today the intent was to maximise the time in the optimal body core temperature range, which is 38.5 to 39.5 degrees Celsius. And that's in order to prevent yourself from overheating and potential illness, injury, dizziness, this kind of stuff, but also much lower than that, and you're not really getting the benefits of the heat training. Now, in order to raise the body temperature quickly, I had the first 30 minutes at 173 watts. That's kind of mid-zone 2 for me. And then I dropped the power to 140, which is about 53% of FTP for the next 15, then 120 for another 15. And I had a little very luxurious 10 minutes of recovery. It wasn't luxurious at all. I mean, it is proper difficult. And then a final 20 minutes, again, at 50% of FTP. Again, trying to keep the heart rate always below 165. Temporarily, I went to 169, but managed to control it in that range. So very happy with the training, and the time I estimate, and it is an estimate, I reckon at least 1 hour 15 in what I hope the core temperature gauge will confirm is the optimal heat temperature range. As an FYI, I am very much enjoying using this Hayabusa suit. Well, I say enjoying, it is a type A pleasure. It certainly brings up the temperature and the sweating very quickly, traps the heat beneath the suit. And I reckon once we have the core temperature gauge, it will show that it brings up my temperature relatively rapidly to 38.5 degrees Celsius or a little bit more. We'll see. But definitely liking it. It's a martial arts sweatsuit, not an item of cycling apparel. Another morning of training, and fitness is definitely on the up, whilst the tracksuit top, well, that's back on. I reckon the impact of the heat training is to make me feel, well, that bit more chilly at the end of the training, notwithstanding the fact that the weather is decent outside. It's early August, and it's about 20 degrees. Anyway, on the menu was the McCarthy Special, a proper nasty Zwift training. Here we go. There you go, beautiful outside. And here's the McCarthy Special. A nasty Zwift training comprising 3 minutes just below threshold, 3 minutes just above threshold, 3 minutes VO2 max. Repeat thrice. You may not have 9 minutes recovery between each, but the descents for the hardest 100 are shorter than that, so I dialed them back to 6 and 7 minutes respectively. I also dialed back the intensity for the first couple of reps to 91% and about 94% respectively, with about 97% for the final one. I wanted quality, and definitely there was good power throughout. Then 6 or 7 minutes recovery, maybe 8 actually, and into a Burbage Moor replica, 15 minutes at 274. Jane calls me the cycling tadpole. Anyway, heat training number 5, another session of progress, this time 1 hour, 31 minutes at 151 watts compared to 1 hour 33 at 140 in heat training 4. Also, I managed 40 minutes at 175 watts, keeping the heart rate below 165. The conditions outside are similar, and then average, I guess, around about 130, 135 watts for the second segment of 45 minutes, keeping the heart rate below 165 until the very end, where I peaked a little bit. Here we go, here's the training. It is a miserable training, but there you see, 40 minutes, 175, then dialing back the power, bringing it up, and then dialing it back a little bit as the heart rate got towards 165, and then allowing myself to go as high as 170 at the end. Onwards. It's a messy old business, the heat training, as you're going to see in a second. It's completely fatiguing, not indicative of the TSS for the ride, and definitely all kinds, and I do mean all kinds of redness. Now, check out this. Like a reservoir. It's literally dripping. There we go. It does look like the membrane on the inside of the trousers coming away, where potentially the thighs are rubbing a little bit in the cycling motion. The core heat monitor has arrived, and there it is, strapped to my heart rate belt monitor in all of its glory. So this morning, ahead of tomorrow's number 6 heat training, I decided to conduct a little bit of an experiment to see what my normal core temperature is in a standard zone 2 rise, mimicking the power I managed for the first 40 minutes of yesterday's heat training with the fans off, the doors closed, and wearing the Hayabusa suit. Yesterday, you may remember, I managed 175 watts for 40 minutes before the heart rate peaked at about 165, 166 BPM, and then I had to drop the power. For the hour and a half, it was about 151 watts and circa, I think it was circa about 159, 160 heart rate average for the hour and a half. So this morning, I kind of replicated the power a little bit higher, 178 watts, and here's the results. So 178 watts, my heart rate remains stable, lower than usual as it happens, at about 120 BPM, average about 119 for the full hour and a half. And certainly I was sweating a little bit more than normal, so maybe that was helping with the cooling. And certainly you feel a hell of a lot fresher in contrast to yesterday's training, where it got, well, pretty emotional at times. But turning to the actual data from the core monitor. Now you'll see that when I woke up about 6 o'clock and then set up the device, my core temperature was about 37 degrees Celsius, and it gradually rose to about 38.1 throughout the training. So that provides a nice little baseline for me to assess the incremental kind of benefit of wearing a Hayabusa suit, not just on the skin temperature and the perceived exertion, but also on the actual core body temperature. So let's see what the difference is in core temperature, as well as heart rate and all that kind of stuff tomorrow. Heat training number 6, this time with the core heat monitor, and certainly the data was enlightening and in line with all of the theory. So I spent my usual 40 minutes warming up, 172 watts. The perceived effort was that bit higher, so I didn't try and go for 174, 175. Heart rate peaked as always around about 167, 168. I dropped it back down, then I had to gradually fettle down the power for the next 50 minutes in order to last for an hour and a half. However, at the point at which I stopped the first kind of hard effort of 172 watts, my core heat temperature was 38.4, and then it gradually rose consistently towards 39.5, and as I kept dropping off the power, I was able to kind of keep the temperature in that kind of Goldilocks range, right? Not going above 39.5. And so a key lesson for me is that really once you're warmed up, once the core temperature is warmed up, the intensity of the ride is less important than sustaining the time. Therefore, dropping a power, I think, is a good decision, and hopefully will leave me with enough energy for an outdoors training tomorrow. I spent about 70 minutes in the ideal 38 to 39.5 degree window in terms of what is optimal for heat training. So onwards. The 10 out of 10 score denotes a very high heat training load because I spent a lot of time in that Goldilocks 38.5 to 39.5 core temperature range, and that's very stressful on the body. 70 minutes active, at least another 15 passive. That definitely adds up and is hard to recover from. You need great hydration and electrolytes during and after, but also I ended up getting a bit of a headache after this and a few of the others. Therefore, I probably advise to keep it a little bit to the left side of 10 out of 10.
Well, it's Sunday morning and the level of excitement is high because I'm 1 week away from the band of climbers' hardest 110, 3,500 metres of climbing in just 110 kilometres. Properly looking forward to it. So in honour of the band of climbers, I got on my Sunday best, one of my favourite cycling jerseys, a BOC original, replete with a mountain on the chest. Love this jersey, definitely save it for best special occasions. And today is one such, because ahead of the event, I wanted to get my climbing legs kind of fired up. And the only climb near me that kind of has the gradients and the kind of length that's equivalent to the stuff that we've got, 27 climbs for the band of climbers hardest 110 in the Sheffield Peak District region, is Whiteleaf. 1.4 kilometres at 11%. I completed it 6 times. First time was a warm-up, although definitely opened up the lungs somewhat, 270 watts for that, and then 5 times about 305 watts for about 5.5 minutes, with just 3-4 minutes recovery in each, just the time it took me to descend. I allowed myself a little bit more time on the final descent. So really happy with the training, managed to stay in the saddle for the most of it, so definitely that's better for keeping heart rate that little bit lower. And I checked out the data on the core, and my maximum body temperature was only 38.4, and that's including heart rate getting all the way to 180 BPM. So that kind of shows you just how hard you have to work in order to get into that optimal heat training zone of 38.5 to 39.5 degrees. Anyway, time for a bit of a nice kind of bumble around the Buckinghamshire region before get home, carb up, have a nice little Sunday afternoon with Jane, and then prepare for the BOC 110. You can see here, I was monitoring the heart rate, but also the perceived effort. Half an hour at 173 watts, heart rate got to about 166. Then I dropped the power for the next 30 minutes or so to about 125, but then I had to drop it right down for the final, 25 minutes or so to about 100. Definitely riding on perceived effort, enabling me to control the heart rate, but also keep the core temperature stable at around about 39.1 to 2. It's the Wednesday before the band of climbers hardest 110, and I've just completed my final tough interval training. Hard start, FTP. Basically 90 seconds at VO2 max into 6.5 minutes at FTP. 4 minutes easy pedaling for recovery, repeat 4 times. It's a proper tough training, especially because it's warm outside, more than 20 degrees, and I was feeling that in the pain cave, especially with the fans turned off. So I spent plenty of time with my core temperature elevated, as it turned out. Here's the training. And there you go, you can see I was pretty consistent with the training. The 90 seconds VO2 max is to represent a kind of tough, steep gradient on those grippy Yorkshire climbs for the first 90 seconds. I was averaging about 300 to 310 watts, down at the kind of 300 watt range for the final interval, and then into about 260 to 265 watts for the 6.5 minutes at FTP, again at the lower end of that range for the final interval. But you can see the heart rate was seriously elevated, 181 to 182 for the final couple of intervals, and that's because it's warm outside, and definitely my core temperature was elevated, 38.5 to about 38.6 for at least 35-40 minutes, because I also had the fans turned off for the final 25 minutes at zone 2. So I'm hoping that I also get an unexpected heat training benefit as a result of this session. Anyway, tomorrow, a final heat training and an easy pedaling ahead of the Band of Climbers event. Band of Climbers, the business. Thank you very much. So that's the Band of Climbers' toughest 110 under the belt, and what an event it is. Thoroughly absorbing course. It is relentless, up and down, but super happy with my fitness for this. 198 watts for 4 hours 45 minutes, 238 watts normalised,
And certainly I felt good even in the latter parts of the climb. Burbage Moor is a decent old climb. I reckon about 270 watts average, maybe a tad more. So I reckon the heat training paid off because the heart rate was pretty low and controlled throughout, even on the longer ascent. Fitting now to conclude this video with an hour of power FTP test. However, as an FYI, there's going to be another video to come about the training in the build up to Gran Fondo with Lombardia. It's going to include all the specific efforts and the strength training, but also I've persevered with the heat training. Well, as you saw, I certainly felt I had a really nice fitness benefit from the heat training during the Band of Climbers hardest 110, both in terms of the consistency of the power. I sustained really nice top-end threshold power right the way throughout the 4-hour, 44-minute event for me, including the penultimate climb, Burbage Moor, and also the final climb, but also the heart rate was very consistent throughout. I didn't get much above 174, 176 BPM towards the end of the harder efforts at any stage. So that was nice indication as to the benefits of fitness on a reasonably nice day. It wasn't particularly hot, certainly wasn't cold, it was Goldilocks of the heat training. So I thought it only appropriate to round off the heat training with an FTP test. It turned out to be 2 different FTP tests, 2 full fat FTP tests, the hour of power. First one on Saturday, I averaged 280 watts for an hour and 5 minutes. But when I got home and I looked at the power versus the speed, I thought, well, something's a little bit off here. Power's too high, speed too low. So I took off the Asioma pedals, recalibrated the power, and after the heat training with the doors closed, the fans off yesterday, the Bianchi and I went again today. Proper emotional. 274 watts this time for an hour and 2 minutes. Much happier with the power, 39.6 kilometers an hour average. And definitely that's the best that I've done for quite some time. Literally since the accident where I broke my back, my neck, my jaw, took a nasty hit to the head. It has been a long road back for me. 274 is about, I guess, 4.15 watts per kilogram. So definitely I'm really happy with the benefits of the heat training, what with the Band of Climbers hardest 110 and the FTP test today, and ahead of my bigger events next year on the continent, including La Marmotte, where it's going to be potentially hot, and also at altitude, I'm going to bring the heat training back into the program. Now, if you're going to use the heat training, I would recommend build up into it slowly. Don't go straight in for an hour and a half at that elevated core temperature. Definitely, as did I, maybe start with an hour overall, where basically the final half hour is going to feel really nasty, and then add maybe 10-15 minutes each time, because it is super stressful on your body to bring that core temperature up so high. And that's why I think the core heat monitor has been helpful, because certainly, as I said, when I had the doors closed and the fans off, whilst it took a bit longer for the core temperature to rise, I was able to have a much less stressful but successful heat training in that Goldilocks range of 38.5 to 39, rather than going as high as 39.5. So definitely something I recommend, but be aware of the stress on the body, listen to the sensations on the body, and bail out of it if it's feeling just too difficult, or you're feeling ill or anything like that. I think it is something to take with caution, but I'll be using it next year, and for now, ciao.